Okay, welcome back. So we're going to move on now to community and private policing. So what is community policing? Well, it's a lot like what police became after the Fitzgerald inquiry. Commenced in the 1980s, and it's all about building partnerships. So in the 1950s, the police came off the streets and into cars. The beat got much bigger, leading to a loss of legitimacy and links to the community. And it was also a loss of eyes helping them with reporting what was going on. In the 1980s, there was a big move back towards community policing. So officers were told, get into your area, serve the community, work together and build relationships. Get people to take ownership of their community, make it a defensible space and have guardianship for it. And this is the way it's done. Things like neighbourhood watch, police beats in shopping centres, just about all of them have got them. School-based police officers, very common now. I know that Brisbane Stay High has a police officer that is there full time because it is such a big school. Police liaison officers, these are people who are the non-sworn police who wear the yellow epaulets on their shoulders, and they liaise between a community and the police. So you will see Aboriginal liaison officers who are working with the police in Aboriginal communities and are providing that connection. I really want you to watch this video here about a town in America called Camden, where they removed the whole police force and came back with a different one that was much more community focused, and how that is now working for them. Okay, according to the advocates for community policing, these are the strengths. This is just for your information. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but it recognises the need for citizens to be involved in their communities, in their own policing, focuses on social control rather than social order rather than control. It provides a much more efficient use of resources. It restrains police paramilitary tendencies, so weaponry, special tactics, and some claim that community policing is now outdated in an age of international terrorism, or is this an effective way of countering terrorism by the use of community eyes and ears? And when we first had all the terrorist attacks in America in 2001, community policing, where the community was being asked to be the eyes and ears and report anything that you saw that was suspicious, was a really big deal at the time. Okay, the critics of it. Well, what does community mean? They will say that police are still setting the agenda. It is not a true partnership. Citizens still lack the knowledge or the information that they need, and do they care anyway? So ultimately, it is about improving local surveillance. Community just assists in the control of local undesirables, and respectable groups only are involved. So there's local power or pressure groups that are putting pressure on the community to behave themselves. But at the end of the day, they're still trying to find out who the bad guys are. So now we're going to talk about problem-oriented policing, which came after community policing. So we've talked about problem-oriented policing and looked at some videos about it, but this is where we're focusing on targeting and fixing specific crimes. So remember the guy in the YouTube clip who talked about the liquor store and the problems that were happening in the car park? Well, they just closed the store a bit earlier or altogether rather than arresting people. The other video where he was discussing prostitution, they moved to addressing the issues as to why they were doing it and just didn't keep arresting them for doing it. So the emphasis here becomes on utilising research evidence to analyse the problem, then develop and implement evidence-based strategies to deal with the problem rather than just keep arresting people over and over and over. Because as we know, the police focus on specific crimes. So every school holidays, they'll have a speeding blitz or a drink driving blitz. Okay, that's problem-oriented policing, where they're targeting a particular problem. Next time you're talking to Greg, why don't you ask him about what problem-oriented policing resources we have in Brisbane and in Queensland. So, like I said, when they have a focus on drink driving, now this only goes to 2010. I haven't been able to find this graph again with more recent statistics, but I think that you will find that if you are just discussing drink driving, from the 1980s where they started to focus on drink driving as being a problem, we've had a really big reduction in road deaths caused by drink drivers. They're still out there, and some of them, you know, are 4 or 5 times the limit, which means that they can barely stand, let alone drive a car. But what have we done in Queensland to make, or in Australia in general, to make this big reduction? Well, the first thing that was done was to lower the blood alcohol limit. It used to be 0.08 and it's now 0.05. That worked. Then there were random breath tests. The RBT buses were introduced in the mid-90s. So random breath testing, you can get pulled up at any time, anywhere, and breath tested. I can remember getting pulled up when I was about 38 weeks pregnant, and we were driving home one night, and my then husband had had a few drinks, so I was driving, and it was on a really, really dark road. So the officer concerned couldn't actually see that I was really pregnant and still made me blow into the bag. I was flat out blowing into the bag, but I still got there. And so that was right back in the 1980s when random breath testing was in its infancy, but became really big in the next decade. And we've had media education campaigns, and we still have them out there, but we went through a period where they were very, very prevalent. Don't drink and drive, you're a bloody idiot. Those sorts of campaigns where they showed the outcome of what could happen if you were drinking and driving as far as causing an accident. Those ads have now changed to mobile phone use. So they're showing these ads about crashes that can occur if you are distracted by your phone. So they've moved on to a different focus. So from there, we're moving on to intelligence-led policing. So this first little quote here, intelligence-led policing is crime fighting guided by effective intelligence gathering and analysis, comes from former police chiefs of the NYPD and LAPD. Okay, so they recognised back then that it could be the most important law enforcement innovation of the 21st century. So what this is all based around is that the criminals are becoming smarter, so the police need to be smarter too. So they gather a lot of intelligence and information, and this is evidence-based policing. They use this to identify high-risk people, offenders and victims and places. Okay, hotspots. They can then decide where they're going to target those police resources to either arrest people or move them on and change the space so that there's no longer crime happening. Okay, so it's essentially a risk-based model. The most important thing that you have to understand here is that this is all evidence-based policing, which is really important. Specialist agencies, this is all just for your information only. So I'll just shut up for a second, let you just read it. Here are some more. Okay, so there is a trend for growth in specialist agencies to deal with different crimes as they come up, keeping in mind that we did not have anything to do with the internet as being a crime until about 20 to 30 years ago, when it became very big. So there's lots and lots of agencies that have grown from that. Then there's all your government committees which oversee and coordinate activities. So there's many of them. That's only two, but there's many, many more. There's corruption, there's terrorism. There are all these groups that are oversighting police agencies, oversighting government. So there is an awful lot going on that you probably don't even know about. So let's move on to private policing. This has undergone tremendous growth, simply because we have to remember that police are a finite resource. They can't be everywhere. So there is a need to hire privately for protection. Can you imagine if Suncorp Stadium or Lang Park, as I always remember it, was full to capacity, which is what, about 40 to 50,000 people, and there was no private security there, it was all just police. That would be an awfully big imposition on police numbers that are then out in the community that can't be out in the community because they're at the footy. Okay, so there is this big concern of this fear of crime and the growth of the sense of the risk society. Privatised protection, only the affluent can afford it, although a lot of it is now they are employed by companies or groups. Potential for greater cooperation. This could be an issue in the future. State police, which is your uniformed police and private police, do not always see eye to eye. In some countries, there are more private police than public. Think about places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where there are a lot of private police employed protecting oil and opium, which is heroin. There are a lot that go over there from Australia who are working as private police, who are usually ex-forces or police themselves. They have different domains. They work in different areas. So private security officers have the same powers as the general citizens, but also powers derived from property owners. They do not have the same powers as uniformed police. And at the end of the day, they're not interested in protecting the public. If they are employed by someone who is a property owner, that is where their loyalty lies, with the person who is paying them. Okay, so where do we see private police? Well, like I said before, you go to the footy, you'll see heaps and heaps of private security policing going on there. We see them at airports. Whenever you go to an airport and you go through the scanners and things like that, that is all private security. We see them at music festivals. The Commonwealth Games at the Gold Coast, there were hundreds of them brought in from all over the country. We see them in shopping centres. They are everywhere. Hospitals, you will see private security as hospitals. I've been in Logan Hospital in emergency and watched them chasing people who have absconded in their hospital gown. Okay, so they are everywhere. Now again, this next graph, when we get to it, is 2006. I did try and find the 2016 census to update this, but I couldn't find this particular graph there. But have a look at this one down here. Alarm security or surveillance monitor, 30,000. So there's an awful lot of security providers out there that are doing this kind of work that the police just aren't able to do with the current numbers that they've got. So these people are hired privately by companies to do it for them. Look how many debt collectors, 10,000, and this is 14 years ago. Should imagine that debt collecting will be a rising business at the moment, which is really, really sad. Okay, private police. As I said before, they do not have the same powers as public police. They cannot legally carry weapons. They have no powers to arrest or detain a person. They have no power to enter dwellings. They have a security license, which is what they operate under, totally different to being a uniformed officer. They cannot install listening devices, and police have to get permission to do that. They can't just go and willy-nilly install listening devices into someone's home. They cannot demand a person's name and address. And as part of a condition of entry, say to a festival or to the football, they may be permitted to look into a person's bag. Okay, so think about the main areas where they're used as we discussed: festivals, sporting venues, things like that. So where do they work together? Where do we find that our normal police and our private police will work together? Well, at airports. At Brisbane Airport, if you've ever sat there, you'll see that federal police officers will be wandering around, but you've also got private security. At concerts, sporting events, shopping centres, first responders to alarms, you will always have the uniformed police working in conjunction with private police. The G20, when we had the G20 in Brisbane a few years ago when Barack Obama came over for it, so quite a few years ago now, the police were, the uniformed police were there in numbers, but there were also a lot of private police. Finally, today we're going to talk about police misconduct because unfortunately it happens. Those of you who watch or follow the police on the Facebook page will notice that very often they put down that an officer has been stood down for disciplinary reasons and they're stood down while an investigation is carried out. So there is a potential. It's greater in policing than in many occupations simply because of the amount of power that they have. Not only is there the chance of corruption, they can abuse that power in other ways. Royal commissions and inquiries have found evidence of it. We had the Fitzgerald inquiry in Queensland in the late 1980s, which was very quickly followed in the early 90s by the Wood Royal Commission in New South Wales. And there's an awful lot of range of failings that police have been criticised for. Neglecting victims of domestic violence. One would like to hope that doesn't happen as much anymore, and sometimes their hands are still tied in what they can do when people make a complaint and then withdraw it. Investigative incompetence leading to wrongful convictions and probably guilty people escaping punishment. This can happen if they get real tunnel vision over the person that they think committed the crime, so they'll move heaven and earth to prove that that person did it. In the meantime, the person who really did it is getting off scot-free. And discrimination in law enforcement. So the nature of policing is that systemic abuses can easily take hold. So that is why we have in every Australian jurisdiction anti-corruption bodies such as the CCC that scrutinise police to ensure that they are following the PPRA. But at the end of the day, the extent of it is difficult to determine because if you don't know that it's happening, then you don't know that it's happening. So this is a little video from the UK about police being replaced by private security. Quite an interesting one for you to watch, so please have a look at that. And this last one tells you about the Fitzgerald inquiry that was held in the 1980s. If you're interested in the Fitzgerald inquiry, there is an excellent Four Corners program that I believe you can still get that was actually done in the 80s and was the catalyst for the Fitzgerald inquiry taking place. However, there's plenty of resources and YouTube clips that you can find about the Fitzgerald inquiry if you're interested in the history of what's happened in policing in Queensland. Very big deal, huge deal at the time. It caused the commissioner to lose his job. He was actually knighted. He was Sir Terry Lewis. He lost that knighthood. There was a high-ranking officer under him called Jack Herbert who became known as the Bagman. And he was the Bagman because he used to go and pick up brown paper bags full of cash. The Fitzgerald inquiry led to the downfall of the JBL-Peterson government. So this was a really, really big deal in Queensland. Okay. That's the end of part 2. This was a bit of a longer one and the content for this week. See you in tutorial for policing.